so bright that we bring hope into the dark. Jesus, friend of sinners, we have strayed so far away. We cut down people in your name, but the sword was never ours to swing. Jesus, friend of sinners, the truth's become so hard to see. The world is on their way to you, but they're tripping over me. Always looking around, but never looking up. I'm so double-minded, a blank-eyed saint with dirty hands and a heart divided. Oh, Jesus, friend of sinners, open our eyes to the world at the end of our pointing fingers. Let our hearts be led by mercy. Help us reach stories of joy and strife, praying for answers, fear of the unknown, needing a purpose or someone to lean on. We followed a path of uncharted ground, and it brought us here, right where we belong. We let our hearts guide our way and learn the reason why we stay. It's giving ourselves to the broken one, bringing new life to the lonely one, finding ourselves in what we love, sharing our stories and gifts with the earth. Every storm, every tear, every fight, every fear, oh, it makes us who we are and worth it all. Every life we change, the hearts we touch, the dreams come true, the fears we crush, and all the roads that lead to what we do. Let the passion start with you. Look at where we are today, with faith in ourselves and what we say. We took a chance, we dared to dream, surrounding ourselves with those who believe. We follow the path that is laid for us, with those by our side who are there for us. We let ourselves seize the day, 'cause nothing can take our dreams away. And we share the love, we share the passion, we show the world what a family feels like. We plant the seeds and watch them grow, and they spread like a wildfire, igniting hearts that need a spark of hope, an unstoppable flame, the reason why we stay. Every storm, every tear, every fight, every fear, oh, it makes us who we are and worth it all. And every life we change, the hearts we touch, the dreams come true, the fears we crush, believing in our cause is what we do. Let the passion start with you.
You may be seated. Welcome. Glad to see everybody here this morning. We're going to start a new series today. If you remember the last few weeks, we've gone through our series called Definitions. And in that, we got a working definition that Darren gave us about Jesus. Because Jesus is a pretty big concept, right? He lived 2,000 years ago. Since then, there's been lots of ideas and teachings and concepts and actions done in his name and around his person and through his church. And so we tried to strip away some of that baggage and look at what is the core of Jesus. What is he really, like what is the very bare bones minimum we need to know to be followers of Jesus? And that was what we looked at the second week. What does it mean to be a Christian, someone who follows this Jesus? And then, of course, last week we talked about what it means, well, the last couple of weeks, what it means to be a church, the ecclesia, this assembly of people who gather together because they're all followers of Jesus. And we heard that it's an assembly of people who give a voice for those who don't have a voice. It's meant to be a representation for the world. We exist on behalf of the world so that together we can follow Jesus' mission of peace and justice and love. So this series, we're going to unpack a little bit further what it looks like to be a church, to be this community of people that gather together in the name of Jesus. This series is going to be called Directions. So we had definitions, and now we have directions. And we're going to look at, over the next 3 weeks at the different directions we face as a community. Another way you could say that is like our posture, the way we position ourselves towards each other and the way we position ourselves as a community towards the world. We're going to talk about backwards, forwards, inward, outward, and upward. The word direction can be very specific, right? Like, hey, can you give me directions to the bathroom? Yeah, that way, turn left, around the corner. Or it can also be this very broad meaning of like purpose or goals or meaning to life. Like if someone's just kind of floating through life, they don't know where they're going, they don't know what's going on day to day, we say, man, that person just doesn't have any direction. They don't have any goals, they don't have any sense of focus. So hopefully in this series we can look at, one, our specific directions, the specific areas we go, so that we can have a larger goal, a bigger purpose, meaning for what we're doing as a church. Here's the thing. I love this church because it's really unique. And it's unique in that we have people here who say they've found a home. We have people here who say they've found a sense of meaning and purpose. We have people who say, hey, I didn't think I'd ever find myself in church again, but here I am. And part of the reason for that is because of the way we've positioned ourselves. And we'll talk about this a little more. But this church has this sense where people can come together in love and community. They know they have a place. They know they have a home. They know they have meaning. And yet, we're kind of all over the place on the spectrum of ideas. Last week in our breakout group, I think we got through like 2 or 3 questions before this big discussion on God broke out. And, you know, what is God? Who is God? How does Jesus relate to God? Do we relate to God on a personal level? Is that possible? Is it not? What does that look like? What does prayer look like because of those questions? These big, big questions that maybe in some churches, those answers would be taken for granted. But nothing's taken for granted here. And that's pretty special. We struggle with each other. We work with each other. We learn from and with each other about the ways to talk about really big things. It's a beautiful thing. But like I was telling somebody this week, that takes creativity and hard work to sustain that. Because think about this. I can get up here and speak. Darren can get up here and speak. Moses, Kyle, Keith, the people who get up here and speak. And we know that some things we might say, some people don't agree with. And if we speak to those people, other people might not agree with it. Even in a group this small, the ideas are so all over the place that it's hard to get up here and speak intelligibly to that group. So it takes work, it takes creativity to be able to speak intelligibly to each other about topics, big topics that we might not all agree on. But that work is a good work to do. That creativity is a fun thing to be a part of. And I think that it's exciting to know that even in our differences, we grow in love for each other and we grow in love for the world around us. So today, we're going to talk about the direction forward. But before we talk about forward, we have to talk about backward. Backward's not a super popular word in our culture, right? Like, backward means you're losing ground. You're not making strides. You're not achieving your goals. We even have a phrase for it, like, if you're not moving forward, you're moving backward, and that would be the worst thing ever, right? Even in the religious context, like, have you ever heard the word backslidden? Like, he's backslidden. He's falling away from the faith that he should be moving forward in. Backwards is not a good word. It's not a fun word. What I mean by backwards is not, let's go back to how it used to be, or let's go to a better place that we've lost. What I mean is, as a community of people, we face our past. We look at our roots, is maybe a better way to say backwards. We have our roots and we have our journey, our backwards and our forwards. So we have to look at our roots today, see where we've come from as a community, to know where we're going as a community. Everybody has a past, obviously, right? If you're here now, you lived in the past at some point. And our past informs us and shapes us and makes us who we are. It's something that you can't escape. It's something that you have to realize brought you to where you are. When you're a child, you have this relationship with your parents. You think they know everything. I'm talking like little child, right? You think they know everything. You rely on them for everything. If a child needs anything from food to going to sleep to being transported a long distance, that's the parent's responsibility. You rely on your parents for everything. As you get older, you don't need to be carried everywhere. You don't need to be fed with a spoon. You don't have to be told everything. You become a more independent person the older you get, and then you realize, hey, I don't need my parents to tell me what to do, and you kind of buck up against it. It's natural. It's part of becoming your own person. And what happens is sometimes in the teenage years or early college years, there can be angst because of that. There can be anger and bitterness between parents and children. Parents are like, the kids are like, I don't need your advice. You don't know anything. And the parents like, no, you don't know anything. I mean, you're like still a baby, you know? But there's this idea where we push up against our parents and we become our own people. And there can be bitterness, there can be angst, can be strife. But as you get older, you look back and you realize, hey, parents aren't perfect because nobody is perfect. I'm not perfect. And, maybe a lot of what they did, they were trying to do it out of love. It came from the right place. Yeah, maybe they did it the wrong way. Maybe they misunderstood some stuff, but it's not like they were out to get me. And even if you had parents that were out to get you, maybe you had parents that were really, really bad. As you get older, you realize, man, they're just acting out what their parents did to them. Life becomes more complex for you when you get older. Relationships become more complex. Your past becomes something you can understand. You can see how it shaped you, and you can move forward. Our journey of faith is very similar to that. A lot of people, when they enter a religious institution or they, come have a conversion experience and they're new in this way of thinking about God and religion and faith, they kind of maybe think like, this new thing I found has all the answers. I mean, some religions market themselves like that, right? Like Scientology, like, we'll get you through this really bad world. We have the answers. That's kind of like how some people think about their religion when they first enter it. Oh, good, now everything's going to be fine. Everything's taken care of. I have all the answers of everything I could possibly need. But as you stay in that institution, a church, a way of thinking, a worldview, you might start to realize like some stuff's not adding up. Things aren't the way I thought they were going to be. It's not all like smiles and wide-eyed wonder anymore. There's disillusionment. There's doubt. There's fear. Maybe you see that some of the doctrinal things aren't adding up, or maybe someone you loved and respected as an authority hurt somebody else, damaged your view of the whole institution. That stuff just happens. And so you can sometimes experience this sense of like a teenage angst. I'm out of here. I can't wait to get out of this place. I can't wait to be on my own, right? But there's another third step in our journey of faith that's mature. And we can look back and say, yeah, maybe that place didn't have everything together. Maybe that system of thought does have some logical fallacies. But there's things there that benefit us. There's things there that I can find that are healthy and whole and life-giving. And so we realize that the questioning, the struggling, the wondering, and all the wandering, they're not necessarily the first steps in leaving our faith. They're just the first steps in embracing a new way to see our life of faith. So I want to look back today at 3 stories from the Bible that demonstrate this complexity that's really built into what we call Christianity. I want to look at our roots, the roots of our ideas that we cling to, like justice and peace and mercy. And I want to see where those came from. And then I want to see what these stories have to say to us now. How we take that root, that core, and go further in our journey. From these stories, I want to point out 3 aspects that really help to sum up the way we view our journey of faith. The first is wrestling. The second is metaphor. And the third is context. So, I want to start in Exodus chapter 3. This is the story of Moses as he's been called to go rescue the Israelites out of slavery from Egypt. That's what the whole story of Exodus is about. And we're going to look in Exodus 3 where he first receives that call to go rescue the Israelites. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it didn't burn up. So he thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush isn't burning up. Verse 7, the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them, so now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. In verse 13, Moses says to God, suppose I go to them and say, the God of your fathers sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what's his name? What do I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This is a really important text for our roots. Because it's very early in the story of Scripture, right? It's like one of the first stories, and it's one of the main stories that sets the tone for the whole Bible. We have this character, a burning bush, and a voice coming out of it. And he's calling itself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Moses' fathers. And the name that this appearance gives to itself is I am what I am. I am who I am. Another way to translate it is I will be what I will be. And we see that this God, every time he appears, usually has the same message to the person he's calling. The cries of the oppressed have reached my ears. Go and rescue them. The story is always the same. The God who calls from the burning bush is calling an individual, a person, a group of people to go work to save the oppressed, to free the slaves, to bring justice and rightness to the world. Have you ever thought about something here? Why didn't God, this voice proceeding from this burning bush, say, hey, Moses, I got an idea here. The cries of my people have reached my ears, and so I'm going to liberate them. Come with me and check it out. Come watch what's going to happen, because instead of appearing as a burning bush, I'm going to appear as a huge mechanized suit with like machine guns and jetpacks. This hasn't even been invented yet. The Egyptians won't know what hit them. We'll just get in there, get out. It'll probably be like 5 minutes. Or why didn't he say, hey, instead of a burning bush, I'm just going to be a huge, huge burning forest and sweep through the streets and set everything on fire and bring the Israelites out? Why is it that God calls Moses and says, okay, go free him. Go free him. Whoa, what? Why? Well, just because I've heard their cries. It's never that God just like shows up in some like superhero form and just blows everything up. It's never how it works. Think about something here. Anything that has ever gotten done, anything in history that has ever happened, right, physically, in the physical realm, has happened because a person did it or a group of people did it. Nothing just appears out of nowhere. Whatever has happened in the name of God, whether that's good things or bad things, because things have happened, people have used the name of God to do some pretty bad things. Anything that's ever happened in the name of God, good or bad, has been done by people in God's name. That's how all the stories in the Bible are. We have references to miraculous events, right? There's times where the people of God have this aid, this help from somewhere, and you see all these crazy stories about like the sun never set for a day, or food appeared everywhere. But it's always because the people needed that. There were actions taken by people in the midst of those stories. What's the point in this? The point is that many of us, probably all of us to some extent, that's why we're here, have felt that same call Moses felt. Maybe you didn't see a burning bush or hear a voice, but you felt compelled at the cries of the oppressed. You felt compelled in love and mercy for those who needed it most. You felt the call of God in your heart. And many times we struggle to describe that experience to others. It's hard to put it into words. And I think that's what God is getting at when he says, I will be what I will be. In different times, in different periods, in different ways, God appears differently. And we can use different words to describe him. The important thing to remember here is that anytime you talk about God, other than saying, he will be what he will be, it is what it is. Once you move beyond that, the mystery of God's I will be what I will be name, you're in the realm of metaphor. Right? Think about some of the things we call God. Father, Lord of hosts, Almighty, Provider, a mother hen. These ways of describing God that obviously no one of those completely describes our experience, completely describes that call we felt. Just aspects of it, which is why we need so many words to try to describe this God experience. So for all of our speaking and everything we talk about, we have to realize that it's metaphor. The next story comes from Genesis 32. A man named Jacob is going to meet with his brother with whom he's been estranged for years. And he's taking his family with him, and he's like trying to figure out what it's going to look like, and he's really worried about it. And then there's this weird encounter that he has. So in Genesis 32, verse 22, we see that Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons. My, how times have changed. And crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he sent them across the stream, he sent all his possessions over. So now Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." And Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked, "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. So the man said, "You will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob says, "Please tell me your name." And he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible because it's so crazy. Like, Jacob physically fights with God, and they end in a tie. Like, Jacob's not a dude you want to mess with if you see him in a back alley. I mean, unless God's just not a good fighter. That could be the case, I suppose. But the point is, Jacob sees this character, recognizes him as God himself, and says, "I'm not letting you go till you bless me." And so what happens? He changes his name from Jacob to Israel. Like, the blessing is, I'm changing your whole outlook on life. You're a completely new person, and you are someone who wrestles with God. And then he forms a nation who takes the same name, a whole nation known for struggling with God. That's a pretty cool title to have, right? And we see this tradition all through the rest of the Bible. Moses constantly is arguing with God, like, "Now let's do it this way. Come on, this way is going to be better. I'm telling you, trust me here." And God will be like, "All right, we'll try your way first. If it doesn't work, we're going back to my way." And then we see that in the Jewish tradition, how they approached sacred scripture, how they approached their relationship with the divine, it was struggle, it was argument, it was debate. In the stories of Jesus, we see this, right? There were professional people whose job it was to debate texts of scripture. Like, that's all they did, is read it, debate it with each other, argue about it, struggle with it, wrestle with it. There's a story about 2 rabbis who were debating a text one day, and they just couldn't come to any sort of agreement, complete deadlock. And each thought his own self was right. Each thought the other was completely off base. They couldn't even compromise at all. It's gone on for hours. Well, God watches this debate and thinks they're taking it really seriously. I appreciate that. You know, like they're putting a lot of effort, work into this. I'm going to go down and I'm going to settle it. Give them the meaning of the text. So God appears before them. And of course, at first, they're like kind of awestruck. And they say, what are you doing here? And God says, I've seen your debate. I've seen that you're wrestling with this text that I've given you. I'm here to give you the meaning of it. So God proceeds to like expound this text to them, and he connects it to other passages they hadn't thought about, and he shows it to them in a whole new way. After he explains it, they sit silently together. They look at each other, and they look at God, and they say, nah, that can't be the right explanation. Thanks, though. And they go back to their debate. That's like classic Judaic thought. We wrestle, we struggle. We don't just debate each other on text. We don't just struggle through the text. We even have to fight with our own concepts of God, our own ideas of what it means to relate to God. So we have metaphor, we have wrestling. This wrestling, this struggling, it doesn't mean that you're like losing your faith. It means you're embracing the faith of your fathers. You're being true to your roots when you experience that. Our final story will help us see maybe the most important part, the part that moves us into the forward stage. Looking into our past, immersing ourselves in the stories we find in the Bible, shows us that everything we are as a people is built on that experience of being called to justice and peace. And since we often struggle to find the metaphors to describe it, our descriptions can look very different from place to place. And that takes us to our third story where we see this in action. It comes from Acts chapter 17. The Apostle Paul has had this call in his life. He's always known that God would call the world to justice and righteousness and peace. He's always believed that. He was well acquainted with all those passages we just read. But now he has this new experience that adds on to it, that Jesus is the one that really shows us this justice and righteousness in all its glory. So now that he's bought into that, he's going around telling people. And he's telling more than just his Jewish friends. He's telling Greek, pagan, Roman citizens, all of that. So as he's traveling around trying to share this good news, he ends up in this city, Athens. And as you probably know from like history or maybe like hearing this story before, Athens was a very like intellectual city. They loved philosophy. In fact, Luke, the author of Acts, says, like it's parenthetical. He's talking about the Athenians, and then he says, all they do all day is sit around and talk about new ideas. Like that's how he describes it. It's almost like they're a bunch of nerds is what like Luke's getting at. Like all they do is sit around and talk about ideas. So Paul's in town, and he's got a new idea. And some of the philosophers come up to him like, hey, we hear you've been like saying this stuff. Like, come tell us about it because we love to debate things. We love to struggle with ideas. So he goes into their meeting place. He stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and he said, people of Athens, I see that you're very religious. As I walked around and looked at all your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you're ignorant of the very thing you worship. That's what I'm going to proclaim to you. That God, the unknown God that you have this altar to, made the world and everything in it, and is the Lord, the ruler of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. He's not served by human hands as if he has needs. Rather, he himself gives life and breath and everything else. From one man he made the nations. They will inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their times and history and boundaries of their lands. And he did all this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, although he's not very far from any one of us. As one of your own poets have said, we are his offspring, and in him we live and move and have our being. So I want to make a couple points with this story. First, look at what Paul does. He's got his message, right? He has his message that is very old, nothing really new. Jesus bringing it to light is a new aspect, but he still is clinging to the promise of peace and righteousness, a hope for a better world. He's got that message. He's experienced it in his call from Jesus. But he uses all the language and all the symbols of the Athenian philosophers. Right? Think about this. He doesn't use any Jewish categories in this discussion. He doesn't say the Lord of hosts, right? The Lord of the army of angels has sent me to you. That's how all the prophets start their talks, isn't it? The Lord of hosts has sent me. I speak on behalf of the Almighty. He doesn't use the word Yahweh. He doesn't use God's I am who I am name. He doesn't use any of God's other titles, any of his other metaphors that we see in the Old Testament. He doesn't use any Jewish categories. He talks in their language. He uses the things they know to explain his message. He contextualizes it, puts it in their context. Here's some examples. He uses their imagery, right? He saw the temple, and he saw the altar that said, to an unknown God. And he's like, all right, unknown, I am who I am. Yeah, the mystery thing, that lines up. I'm going to run with this. And he's like, hey, the God that you don't know, the one that maybe is unknowable, I'm going to talk to you about that one. And then he takes their explanations of God, their usual ones, and he uses them, but he does it in the negative, right? He says, don't need temples. God is not. It's a great way to talk about God in the negative. We don't know everything he is, but we definitely know some things he's not. He doesn't need your priest to bring him food and wine every night. He's not going to get angry if you don't sacrifice your animals to him, right? He's taking their other categories and showing that God doesn't fit with them. And then he goes on and he talks about God as being the giver of life, almost the ground of all being. He says that we proceed from him. We're his children is the word he uses. He says that we live in him. We move within him. We have our very being within God. But those phrases come from pagan philosophers and poems, right? Paul's quoting those things. They're not from the Old Testament. He's not quoting Jeremiah or the Torah. He's not using the law like you would expect Paul to do. The man who bragged about how Jewish he was, right? I'm from the right family. I was circumcised at the right time. I followed all the laws, and I'm still doing it. You want to talk about a Jewish Jew, don't know if that's appropriate to say, but if you want to talk about someone who's got it all together in Judaism, it's me. Paul was very proud of his heritage. Doesn't bring it up. Doesn't talk about it to the philosophers. In fact, he uses their own ways of thinking, their own categories, their own poetry, their own art to explain his message, his call from God. And I want to point out something that is pretty, I think, groundbreaking. Look where that takes Paul. This is the first time we hear anything like this about God in the Bible. There's nothing in the Old Testament about living within him, getting our being out from him. He calls God Father, but the way Paul says that we are his children, it means he's our source. We originate from God. These are very Greek categories that haven't appeared before, and yet Paul's very comfortable introducing them. And look what happened. It's part of our text. It's part of the thing that informs the way we think about God. So it's okay to be able to take the message, the call we have, that pull, that divine pull towards justice and peace that we see played out in the life of Jesus, we can take that and talk about it in categories that are not our own or that are maybe outside of the church walls, right? What if someone took the message of Christianity and talked about it in terms of philosophy today? Paul was talking about it in terms of ancient Greek philosophy. There are people that are doing that, and it's really cool. It's not for everybody. It's not for all of us. No, not everyone's a philosopher. Not everyone has the time to sit around in the Areopagus all day and debate ideas. But people are doing that, and people have always done it. Augustine talked about Christianity in terms of the philosophy of his time. St. Thomas Aquinas, David Hume, Blaise Pascal, right? Guys who, every time it changed, none of those guys would agree with each other, but they're all seeking to put that divine call they felt into the context of that modern time. And people are doing it today. John Caputo, Catherine Sarah Moody. People are doing the hard work of putting the Christian message into current philosophical terms. And my point with that is we should embrace that. Unfortunately, when a lot of these guys were like in their time, they were outside of the church walls. They were ostracized or looked down upon. Paul, it happened to him. The traditional Jewish people were pretty harsh towards him, right? In fact, after this story, some Jewish leaders come to Athens and stone him, throw rocks at his head and body to kill him. Because he's like, I'm not doing anything. This is Judaism. I'm not doing anything different here. They're like, nope, too different. You can't be talking in pagan categories. You can't talk about this Jesus guy. It's not going to work out for us. We can't be like the people who stoned Paul, right? We have to allow for contextualization. We have to realize that the way we talk is metaphor, that the roots of our past allow for metaphor, contextualization. And what was the third one? I'm going to cheat, going blank. Wrestling. For most of us, our call to justice and peace came from Jesus. Seeing the stories of Jesus, being raised in churches that talked about the message of Jesus, hearing stories of what Jesus did on this earth. But even with that, even with all of us agreeing that we're centered around Jesus, there's lots of room left for how we describe it to ourselves and how we describe it to others around us. So the call today is, as we embrace our roots, our call to justice that we see most clearly in Jesus. As we embrace that and move forward with learning how to contextualize it, let's give each other grace and let's give each other space. We have to allow for disagreement, for struggling, for wrestling. If we do that, we'll be in really good company. We'll be able to put our name down on the list with like Paul and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Moses and Jesus. If we do that, I think we'll also create a place where more people can hear that call that Moses felt, can hear the call that we have felt to go and pursue the divine call of justice and peace and mercy and love. And I think we'll also create a place where people can experience God for themselves without some of the baggage that can be forced upon people when they try to find God. Like Paul said, everything we see around us, it's all just so that people can reach out. Perhaps, he says, perhaps find God. That's what we're doing here. That's what we're trying to do. Next week, we'll look at outward and inward. I won't tell you what that means. You'll have to come back. Let's pray.